a Kangaroo Fern production.
I'd say, if you're getting started, just focus on building quality content and being consistent about it to reach your audience, and just have fun. Enjoy yourself, have fun along the way.
This podcast is produced and managed by Kangaroo Fern Media Lab, Australia's independent video and podcast company. We do the podcasting hard bits so you don't have to. We make podcasts easy. Book a call at www.kangaroofern.com.
Hello, Humanista and Pod Fiesta. Welcome to another episode of That Podcast Exchange. For today's episode, our guest for today, you cannot believe it, but I'm still on shock. But our guest for today is James Mulvaney. And who's that? He is the founder of radio.co, podcast.co, and my favorite matchmaker.fm when I'm trying to find a guest on my podcast. So radio.co is a complete radio station management tool, while the podcast.co is a full service podcasting, including platform for hosting and distribution to common outlets like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And of course, the matchmaker.fm, it's like a Tinder, but for podcasters. So you can get your guests or pick your guest or whatever category you want, and you can choose any guest on that platform. Please welcome to That Podcast Exchange, James Mulvaney. Hello, thank you for your time, James. How did you start it? So you got three good project or program, the radio.co, the podcast.co, and matchmaker.m. How did it started?
So I've been an entrepreneur since I was 16. Like, I first started out when I was just left school. A lot of my friends were going out and getting jobs, working like in McDonald's or Subway or whatever. And I was like, I don't want to do that. I want to see how I can make some money online. So that's like basically how I got started. And since then, I've run a number of different businesses. Most have been in the audio streaming or the audio space in general. That's where sort of my passion lies. I was originally like interested in going to radio as a DJ. So back when I was younger, like I wanted to go on air, but I was also really, really interested in the technical aspects of radio and how do you get audio and put it on the internet. So this was like way back in like 2004, 2005, around then, which was when I launched my first ever business. And since then, I've, as I say, kind of always stuck with audio. So radio.co, we launched in 2015, really, really successful business. We grow into around 5,000 customers, or just shy of 5,000 customers now. With podcast.co, that came a couple of years later. And then Matchmaker, which is our community platform that connects podcasters with their guests, that launched in 2020, just around the time the pandemic hit. So March 2020, we launched Matchmaker around then into kind of like beta. And pandemic hit. A lot of people stuck at home, and a lot of people decided to start podcasts and wanted to connect with people in ways that they couldn't do before, because obviously suddenly you couldn't go and do face-to-face interviews. Everything had to be done online, which is why Matchmaker grew, I think, so quickly. And we're at 40,000 users now, Matchmaker, which is awesome.
Well, so 40,000 user on Matchmaker. Did you expect that?
No, I mean, remember when we first launched, it was like the challenge was, how do we get to 100 users? And then I thought, okay, how do we get to 1,000 users? And then it was, right, like, let's try and see. Once we got to 1,000, which actually happened pretty quickly, we managed to probably go from 0 to 1,000 within the first, I'd say, like month or so. We had about 200 people who were kind of on the waiting list, if you like. So they were our first early stage users. And we had some really good feedback from them. We then kind of put it out to the public and started getting more and more traction. And then it was kind of a case of like, how do we hit 10,000 and then 20,000 came really quickly. It's sort of, the growth has slowed a little bit over the last, say, six months or so. I think that's just partially because like pandemics kind of getting back to normal, and things are sort of going back to normal. So people aren't sat around as much like thinking about starting podcasts or whatever, but we are still growing, and we're still getting hundreds of users signing up every single week, which is amazing. And yeah, it's great. It's really interesting to run 3 different software platforms that all kind of have some synergies between them. So although radio.co, for example, is completely different to Matchmaker, and podcast.co is different again, there's a lot of correlation between them.
That's great. So you say Matchmaker is still growing. Is that
Yeah.
so? Do you saying that if you are an early stage podcaster, you have to
Yeah.
be on that platform to grow your podcast?
I would say if you want to get more exposure for your own podcast, going on other people's podcasts is a must. Just because, number one, you can kind of tell other people about your show, but also you've got to think about it as a networking tool. You're meeting other people in your industry or who are doing similar things. You might pick up some tips from them, so I think for sure, go on other people's podcasts. I think Matchmaker is a crucial tool for anyone who's starting a podcast. Don't worry, it doesn't matter if you haven't got any listeners or if you're just growing your audience and you're only starting to get a little bit of traction. The sooner you can start networking and meeting other podcasters. And by the way, Matchmaker doesn't just connect podcasters with guests. We also connect podcasters with podcasters. So we have people who are interested in doing promo swaps or content collaboration, on the platform as well. So yeah, the sooner you can get networking, get out there and start chatting to other podcasters, the better. I think that's crucial for anyone who's thinking about starting a podcast or has just launched their own show.
So networking. Why networking?
Yeah, networking is, I suppose it's kind of just like in real life, isn't it? If you go to conferences or you attend different events in your local area, or sometimes you might fly even further to go to conferences. Generally speaking, you meet people who are really passionate and engaged with the same types of things that you are, whatever that might be. If it's a business conference, or it could be, you go into a comic conference, or something about this sort of like I don't know. I used to be really interested in woodworking when I was a kid. So I used to go to like woodworking events, for example, right? So it's great just to hang out with people who are interested in the same things as you. So that's networking in the real world, right? But the same applies to podcasting. If you're going to go out and meet people, on Zoom and chat to them, or if you're recording podcasts with them, it can only be a good thing. You can use it to share information, get ideas, and fuel creativity.
So we know that podcasting is completely exploded during the pandemic. Do you think podcasting is overpopulated?
No, not at all. No. I mean, the interesting thing is, like, we went from just before the pandemic, I think there was something like 800,000 podcasts on Apple. They then announced, I think it was like April last year, so April 2020, that they hit 1 million podcasts. And now they're up to 2.4 million. So just in that year, they've doubled the number of podcasts. So there is a huge amount of growth in that short period of time, for sure. But what's interesting is most of those podcasts, I think it's some the figures are astonishing. I think it's 26% of all podcasts, something like that, have got only one episode. So people have thought, I'm going to start a podcast. They record an episode, they publish it, goes up onto iTunes or Apple Podcasts, and then they kind of give up, and they feel a bit sort of like, oh, well, I didn't get 1 million listeners to my first episode, so why should I bother recording the second? Which, of course, is, unrealistic expectations. I think people go into it thinking they can put in a minimum amount of work and just suddenly, get this huge audience. The reality is, of course, you've got to work really hard and you've got to be consistent with what you're doing. If you're not consistent, if you don't work hard, you're not going to get the audience you want, unless you already have, a name for yourself, or an audience that you've already built. So, for example, like, let's say you're super famous, or you've got lots of followers on Instagram, or you've got like a YouTube channel, or you've got a business that has a big email marketing list. those kind of things make it easier to launch a podcast for sure. But if you're just starting from nothing, you've got to work hard at it.
Work hard. So that's what is the challenges you encounter if a new podcaster just launched their show?
Well, I think a lot of people, when they start out, they don't really know what makes a good podcast. They kind of go at it and they just think, let's just record something. They don't think about it. So I think the first thing to do is think about who your audience is. Who do you want to reach? And think, literally map out. My advice to new podcasters is map out you work on it a season at a time. Don't just commit to doing one episode every week for a year, because it will become too much work. And, if you're a busy person, if you've got all the time in the world, let's say you're retired or something, or you don't have to work for whatever reason, sure, do an episode a week. But most of us, we've got to work, and we're doing a podcast as something that's kind of a side project, right? So the best thing to do is craft a podcast in seasons. Look at doing maybe 6, 8, 10 episodes per season. Then you need to look at what each episode in that season contains and how do those episodes relate to each other. So rather than just thinking of each episode as its own thing, think of the whole season as a story. Each episode links together and you're kind of telling a story. And that can be something that's kind of, fictional. If you're doing like a true crime podcast or telling stories, that kind of stuff. Or it could be like, real world advice. Like say you're doing a podcast about, health and nutrition or business or marketing. Like think about which episodes, you want to craft and what the focus of each episode is going to be. And if you can map that out before you record your first episode, your chances of reaching episode number 10 are going to be greater than if you just say wing it for the first episode with really no idea who you're trying to target, what you're trying to talk about, and then just leave it at that.
So you're saying you need to have a good plan.
Yeah, absolutely. Plan. And also, again, if you can, try and plan, if you're interviewing guests, get good questions to ask that guest, find out, if they're an expert. Let's say you're creating a podcast on marketing and you want to find an expert on search engine optimization. Okay. What questions do your audience have about SEO? What things could you ask that expert that will really draw on their expertise and their knowledge that would make an interesting conversation? If you just go to it unscripted and have no idea what to talk about, or haven't really researched SEO, you don't maybe know that much about it yourself. Well, your conversation could end up being pretty bland or not containing very much depth. Whereas if you come to them with like some really, really good probing questions that kind of will allow them to kind of put their expertise forward in the best possible way, your episode is going to be much more exciting and engaging for the audience. So planning is crucial, I think, to creating any good podcast.
Next question about that is how to make your listener engage to your podcast.
This is a good question. I love this. I think podcasters, again, one of the downfalls is they don't spend enough time thinking about how to engage with people, right? Now, I'm a marketer. I love building businesses and websites and creating funnels and all that kind of stuff, that kind of nerdy marketing. And the first and foremost thing about marketing is you want to try and get that person's contact details. You want to create some kind of activation which causes them to say, oh yeah, by the way, my name is Bob Jones and here's my email, bobjones@gmail.com, right? That's the first thing you try and do as a marketer. But podcasters don't tend to do this. And I find this astonishing. So when I create content for my YouTube channel, for example, most of my videos at the end will have some kind of thing known as a CTA, which stands for call to action. And that is basically saying, if you enjoy this video and you want to learn more about ... So if I'm creating a video about podcasting, I have, for example, on my website, jamesm.com/podcast, a free download, which people can go to, which is like a 5-step checklist to starting a new podcast. So if I'm creating a video talking about, anything to do with podcasting, quite often I'll put that call to action at the end. And then when people find my videos on YouTube or they'll listen to an episode of a podcast, they'll hear that message. They'll then go to my website. They'll give me their name. They'll give me their email address. Suddenly I have a line of communication between me, the podcaster, and the listener. That's crucial because you want to be able to, you don't want to just rely on people to subscribe to your podcast. I don't think that's very effective for two reasons. Number one, not everyone subscribes now. Quite a lot of people just come to listen to one episode, and then they might find that episode really interesting. But if you don't get that person's attention and you don't draw them to your website, say, to get their contact details, they can easily just forget about you and move on to the next show. But also it allows you to update people when new content's available. So if you're posting new episodes, you can email them. As I mentioned, not everyone's going to be subscribed. And also, if you're like me, you end up subscribed to loads of podcasts and you kind of end up not listening to a lot of them because you just don't have the time, and it's like, how do you compete against, I think, let's say the average person subscribes to like 10 or 20 different podcasts. They're not going to they're not going to have 10 or 20 sort of hours a week to devote to listening to each and every single episode of the podcast. So you have to figure out a way to stand out. And I think building a relationship with your audience is really key to doing that.
So how do you do that? Aside from a lot of podcasters now, they also do create community as well.
Yeah, I mean, creating a sort of like a private Facebook group, something like that works really well. Again, it gives people, part of the problem I think with the podcasting ecosystem is it's not really been updated much since 2004. Now there is a group of people who are kind of pushing to update the podcast RSS standards. This is where we start getting quite technical and nerdy, so I'll try and keep this simple. But they're trying to basically, encourage companies like Apple and Spotify to bring what you can do as part of a podcast up to date. Now, when I say this, if you think about, you post a YouTube video, what can people do? They can comment, so they can engage with the discussion of what you're talking about in the video. And not only that, they can comment on specific timestamps as well, so they can talk about certain points within the video. That's really, for me, like a key part of podcasting that's lacking. There's no way for your listeners to engage with specific parts of your episode or give any kind of feedback. So yeah, I mean, the easiest way of doing that is to use a platform that everyone's on, something like Facebook or Twitter, and just encourage listeners to engage with you that way and talk to each other as well, because the chances are your listeners will all have things in common. They'll all share the same kind of passion for whatever topic it is that you're purveying on your podcast, or they want to talk about similar things. So if you can get those guys together in the same group, fantastic. You'll have a great time in there.
So you say video. So YouTube is a video. But
yeah.
What is your opinion about, because I think Spotify is trying to do the video podcast now. What is the future, or what your opinion about that, and what's happening to podcasting space?
It's interesting. I guess this is like where you beg the question, like, what is a podcast, right? Because for a lot of people, the term podcast is a sort of, it's a term to describe like a show where quite often it'll be two people chatting or someone interviewing a guest. But normally it's kind of like content that you follow and you'll listen to, and it's audio. But I think increasingly people just view podcasts as video as well. Like, there are loads of podcasts that are getting most of their listeners on YouTube. I mean, I think Joe Rogan was a classic example of that. Obviously now he's moved entirely to Spotify. Whether Spotify allowing video podcasts have always actually been available on iTunes, believe it or not. But it's kind of, I think YouTube has really taken the video the crown when it comes to video on the internet. Back at, if you rewind 10, 15 years ago when these video sharing platforms were kicking off, YouTube was like one out of many. There was loads and loads of video platforms. I remember there being like sort of probably about 20 at one point. And of course, YouTube somehow managed to kind of get its crown and become the number one destination. And those other video sites, some of them still exist, but most of them have gone. If you think about like Vimeo and Dailymotion, they were amongst those kind of early video sharing sites. But YouTube's really, you want to watch videos online, you go to YouTube, don't you? That's just become the sort of de facto for video. So I don't know, when it comes to Spotify adding video, as I say, it's already there on Apple, but very few people use it, because I think the good thing about podcast is that you can listen to them in the background, can't you? It's audio only. So it's a medium that you don't have to actively engage with. You can just passively listen. You can tune in while stuff's going on, and, while you're doing your housework, or you're driving to work, or you're in the gym, or whatever it might be.
That's the great thing about podcasts, only audio. So you can, whatever you do, you can still listen. So
yeah,
that's the space that we need to check about the video that they're starting up. So what did you say about, because I was looking at some of the YouTube personality, they now start doing their own podcasts.
Yeah.
So is this means that podcasting is now going on the mainstream? Because some of YouTube personality now they have their own podcast as well.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think a lot of I think it sort of went mainstream like in 2016, 2017, maybe. That's kind of my opinion of when podcasting hit the mainstream. Not just YouTube personalities, but like, celebrities. If you look at like a lot of celebrities have got podcasts now. Certainly a lot of celebrities started podcasts over the last couple of years. That has driven up audience consumption as a whole, because if you think about it, those celebrities, they're represented in the mainstream media, which still has, huge following, TV, newspapers, radio, etc. Plus also, big online followings on other platforms. So that someone famous launches a podcast, well, a lot of the people who follow that person will then start listening to that podcast, but then they'll discover other podcasts as well. So they have bought the general public to the medium, which I think, like, if you go back 10 years, there was lots of podcasts around for sure, but they were very, very niche, and they had very selective audiences. And I think it was kind of something that was reserved maybe for people who are more like enthusiasts and more sort of like technical kind of people. They weren't necessarily like stuff that people would listen to. There wasn't a lot of stuff for the mainstream. Whereas now there's a huge selection for the mainstream, as well as lots of niche and interesting things as well.
So you're saying about niche. So for early start podcaster, how, say you have the same niche, how a podcaster can stand out other?
Well, that's really the question, isn't it? Like that, I guess you've got to try and figure out who your audience is first, like I mentioned earlier. Then, niche is good. If you want to do something super specific, it could be better than trying to do something general, because you can really hone in on who your audience is. It might be slightly less competitive, but ultimately, you whatever industry you're in, there's always going to be a podcast there. Now, it was funny. I was talking to one of my financial advisors a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying that he listens to several podcasts that are targeted towards people who are financial advisors. So, it's like whatever industry you're in, there'll be podcasts not just targeted towards the general public, but for people who work in that specific industry too. So again, that's a prime example of how you could do something that's kind of really specific and really niche.
Oh, thank you for that, James. So my next question is that this is always, I think, always number one question to any podcaster: how to monetize your podcast.
Yeah, that's a good one, isn't it? There's this kind of magic figure that gets thrown around the industry, which is like you need 5,000 downloads per episode to get revenue in. Now, this isn't necessarily true, but if you're looking at getting kind of the programmatic ads, which are basically just when ads are automatically inserted, which actually don't pay very well, they tend to come in when you're getting around 5,000 downloads an episode. However, if you're getting, say, 500 downloads an episode or 1,000 downloads an episode, and you know who your audience is, you'll be able to go out and find sponsors. If you might have to go and approach them yourself, you might have to spend a lot of time pitching, but there will be people who will be interested in advertising on your show, and it's then about just brokering a deal. Ideally try and get a deal where you can sign them in for, say, 3-6 months, and you're getting paid a certain amount every month. For that, you'll say, right, we'll mention you 3 times throughout the episode. You're getting an average audience download number of X. But let's say you've got a podcast targeted towards another niche example I came across the other day was beauticians, like health and beauty industry, that sort of thing. So not targeting towards the end user, not targeting towards people who want to do their makeup or whatever, but actually targeting people who work in the health and beauty industry. So like you've got a podcast, you're reaching 500 beauticians who are interested in listening to your podcast every single week. Well, that's really, really valuable if you're running some kind of beauty product that you want to get into the beauty market, because that all those people are working with lots of clients. So it's worth something. That audience is really valuable if you're pitching beauty products. So all you'd have to do if you had a podcast that was reaching beauticians, let's say you only get 500 listeners, is just go after if you email 10, 20 different beauty product lines, say, look, I've got 50, I've got 500 beauticians who are listening to my show every week. Would you like to get your product in front of them? You'll probably find someone who said yeah, right? And that's nothing like 5,000 downloads an episode. And the value of that audience to that company will be far higher than saying getting paid like $5 for every 1,000 impressions on ads that you're getting. So that's one way of monetizing, is obviously this traditional sponsorship advertising route. I think a lot of other podcasts are leaning on their audiences as well. So, you could go with Patreon. Both, I think Apple and Spotify have got monetization options now. So you can actually create a podcast on Apple or Spotify, which people have to pay to listen to. And obviously they'll take a cut of your revenue, but it's a great way of getting cash in, particularly if you've got a loyal following, if you've got a good audience and you can deliver premium content. People will pay to hear it first. People will pay to hear it without adverts in it. The other things to do is sort of like more indirect. Like, so if you're running a business, using podcasts as a lead generation tool, as a way to engage with your audience, can be really valuable. You might not necessarily be making money directly off the podcast, but it's certainly a good way of driving business and engaging with your audience. So lots of brands are going into podcasting for this reason, because it helps with their kind of customer retention. It helps them with driving new business, etc. And also then there's other sort of various different things you can do, such as selling products or selling merchandise, online courses, you name it. People have tried it.
Great. So so there's a lot of option to do if you want to monetize your podcast.
I think first and foremost, just focus on trying to build a good, solid audience, and then think about I don't think you should go into podcasting. If you go into podcasting thinking I'm just going to make loads of money by doing this, you're probably going to be very surprised. I think you need to focus first and foremost on quality and make your podcast good and get a good audience before you start thinking about how to monetize.
And I think you need to have consistent show episode.
Yeah, absolutely.
Next question I have, I spoken to James Cridland, the podcast editor of podnews.net last week for last episode.
Oh, cool.
He's saying that non-English podcast is growing. Why do you think so?
That's a good question. I don't know a lot about this topic. I know for sure I've heard this in, read this in Pod News. I think it's, I guess English speaking market is the biggest market, right? But I think Spanish is second, if I'm not, might be right. So for sure, there are, I guess it's just down to prominence of the language spoken, isn't it? Really, so I guess there are more and more podcasts. I think also the general availability, like in the developing world, more people are getting smartphones, more people are getting access to the internet, which they maybe didn't have 5-10 years ago. That's probably fueling growth as well. But yeah, I think it's just one of these things, isn't it? I think like most things, English is spoken in so many different countries. A lot of people speak it as a second language as well. So that's probably why most podcasts have sort of ended up being English speaking. But yeah, I think you're right. James Cridland, is saying if you're kind of looking at going into maybe creating some new podcasts, look at different, how you can kind of enter different language markets. Again, probably there's not as much competition there, so, but if listeners want the content and they're not being served by a specific topic, then you could get the chance of being number one, basically, in a non-English speaking capacity. But I think it's one of these things. It's sort of quite an exciting time and a lot of opportunity there as well.
Yes, there's a lot of opportunity on podcasting nowadays. It's still in early stage. So what are you most excited about this year, James?
I'm excited. Well, we've got lots of stuff going on at the moment, some of which I could talk about, some which I can't. One of the things that we've just literally launched yesterday, which I'd love to talk about briefly, is we've added a community section to Matchmaker, which is really fun. So with Matchmaker, we've, as I mentioned sort of a bit briefly at the beginning, it connects podcasters with guests, it connects podcasters together. But the way that it's built has always been very much one-on-one private messaging. So if you want to reach out to someone, you have a chat inbox, you get an email notification when you get contacted by someone. But it's very much been about building those one-on-one connections. So one of the things that we're looking to do now is open it up and create more of a community where people can engage with others. So the first step of this is it's quite sort of limited in functionality right now, but we're going to be adding a lot to it next year. We now have a community forum, so you could actually, if you're looking for an expert to talk about a specific topic, you could reach out to the community, you can post it in there, and everyone can see it. And if people are interested, they can then message you. We're going to be making that more open, so we're going to be opening up things like comments. But more excitingly as well is I really have this vision of how we can change the way podcasts are created, because if you're creating a podcast to talk about certain issues, let's say you want to talk about, I don't know, mental health, for example, you could go out there and you could get, say, 4 or 5 different people's opinions on, say, how to cultivate a culture in your workplace which encourages good mental health, for example. Or you want to talk about, I don't know, motor racing. You could go out there and you can find 3 experts on motor racing who, want to talk about people to look out for in next year. That to me is kind of like really exciting. And I think, you don't always have to just focus on interviewing one person at a time. If you think about traditionally how radio and how news programs are made, they don't normally just focus on one opinion. They normally go out there and they'll get multiple people's opinions. So leveraging a community like Matchmaker, where there's 40,000 members we've just hit, so we'll be over 40,000. We're rapidly going towards 50, and next year I hope to hit 100,000. That's another sort of goal that we've got. You could go out there and you could get, say, 4 people to kind of give their opinion, and build your episode based around those 3-4 people's opinions. So I think that's going to be really, really interesting, and that's one of the goals that we have with Matchmaker, to sort of open it up and create more of that community aspect to it, which I think is really exciting.
Yeah, that's really exciting. I can't wait. So if you have a billboard to write one short piece of advice, James, to all our listeners or our who is watching right now, what would you say?
I'd say, if you're getting started, just focus on building quality content and being consistent about it, to reach your audience, and just have fun. Enjoy yourself, have fun along the way.
Thank you. So if anyone want to contact you through online, how they can contact you, James?
So I'm available mainly on LinkedIn. I hang out there a lot. That's where most of my content is. I also have quite an active YouTube channel. So the links to those are on my website, which is jamesm.com/connect. You can find links to all the different social channels on there, jamesm.com/connect. And if you've got any questions, you want to reach out to me, feel free to drop me a message on LinkedIn or one of the other platforms, and hopefully I'll be able to get back to you.
All right. Thank you so much, James Malveni. So thank you so much. So all the links will be in the show notes. And thank you so much for another episode of Podcast Exchange with James. And see you again in 2 weeks' time. Bye.
Awesome. Thanks, Nico.
Are you ready to finally start your own podcast? Maybe you already have one, but need a podcast manager to help you level up. We're here for either. Book a call at www.kangaroofern.com, www.kangaroofern.com.